back, all you nerds. This is Nerdy by Nature, and as always, I'm one of your hosts, Agent Smith.
And I'm Captain Rogers.
And in this episode, we're super excited to bring you our review of one of the hottest collected editions out right now by one of the hottest writers and novelists, and that being Jonathan Hickman's House of X, Powers of X. Also, of course, beautiful artwork from Pepe Larraz and coloring by R.B. Silva. And this one, Cap, from start to finish, was just enjoyable. The second that I closed it, I should preface with saying that I've got the hardcover variant cover at that by Mark Brooks. It's
Absolutely.
actually, I believe, out of print right now, but you might be able to find it at certain retailers, so be on the lookout for that. It's a gorgeous cover. But of course, with all that being said, as soon as I closed the book, I wanted to reread it right away. Didn't have time as we're doing the podcast right now, but it's just a great read, great storytelling, and beautiful imagery. And as you had mentioned in the previous episode, it essentially rewrites some of the X-Men mythos in a big way, and it was just a great read that I'm excited to talk about for sure.
Definitely, and I'm a big fan of Jonathan Hickman. I've got several of his runs on different characters, and he really does a great job with the X-Men and really does a good job to bring them back into prominence, which, I mean, I'd say that a lot of people would say that they never really left, but just the redo and the things he changed, he did it so well and it worked out so well that, I mean, I just couldn't stop reading it once I started. I've actually got the single issues from when they were being released, but I still ended up getting it or into the story a little later than everybody else. And so what I was pleased to find, though, is with this series or run, they don't really go fully numerical. Like, they'll skip between the two different titles, House of X and Powers of X, or Powers of 10 as that one is called. Just the X just goes along with the whole team name. But the good thing about the single issues is at the end of each issue it tells you what issue to read next, and so that helped out a lot because, like I said, I did get into it a little later than everybody else.
It's nice that they do that at the end, because I think for some that are just getting into comic books for the first time, it can get very confusing as to, okay, well, which issue do I need? How much do I need to get invested in as far as tie-ins and things like that?
Right.
And so, of course, for me, I had the luxury of having the hardcover, so it was just chapter 1, chapter 2, and so on and so forth, linear, and I prefer it that way myself.
Right.
But I don't blame you at all, being excited with the single issues as they were coming out.
Right.
Because each one is great in its own right. So, of course, with that being said, Cap, let's go ahead and just dive, we should say before, true Nerdy by Nature fashion, spoiler alert.
Right.
If you haven't read House of X, Powers of X, or Powers of 10, or Hotspots, whatever you want to call it, Hickman's X-Men, etc., you'll want to go ahead and fast forward or skip over this episode. Go back and listen to our Witcher episode, pretty popular right now, and it's a popular show. If you haven't watched that yet, by all means, we're not going anywhere.
Right.
So go binge that, come back, and we'll get this all figured out. With that being said, Cap, let's go ahead for real now and dive into Hotspot, and that's just fun to say. And it's just, like we've said before in the beginning of this podcast, a very well done run. It's just beautiful to look at, fun to read, the plot never gets boring, and some of the different storylines are just very well interwoven amongst themselves.
Oh, it's very intricate and detailed. Like, I would have never... It's amazing what Hickman can do in his writing, and I'd almost even say that I would love to see this version of the X-Men be brought into the MCU.
Oh yeah, for this Hickman run to be an MCU adaptation,
yeah,
I'd be perfectly fine with that.
Right.
Just simply because it's, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but it is. It's just so well done.
Right, and I mean, it almost feels like the X-Men could become the next conflict. Not necessarily bad guys by any means, but like at first being a conflict with these mutant population and the Avengers trying to figure it out. And this would be a good way to introduce them and it be different than any other X-Men way of introducing them.
I think so, and they would absolutely be very problematic for Earth's Mightiest Heroes, because it's like, okay, who are these guys? What
right.
are these guys? How do we tackle them or face them? And then, of course, someone like, who knows, maybe they could actually get James McAvoy to return or reprise his role as Charles Xavier and come in and say, like, hey, listen, I understand the need for violence. At first you weren't, everything, most people fear what they don't understand,
right,
type deal, and then explain, like, we're the X-Men, we're just like you, we're, here for a better cause. Yes, there are some of us that can have evil tendencies and be maniacal, but we are not amongst that collective, so instead of fighting each other, why don't we work together and figure this out? So I think that would be very exciting.
Yeah, it would even be interesting if they have already been on Krakoa, and that's why nobody really knows about them.
Right, much in the way of kind of like a Wakanda type deal, just kind of hidden, off the the radar, quite literally.
Right,
in most instances.
And maybe the snap is what gets them to come out of hiding and see what the heck's going on or something.
Yeah, it could. I feel like it could very easily be seamlessly put into the MCU if they chose to go about it this way.
Right.
And they've got great material to go from.
Oh, yeah.
And so, of course, let's go ahead and continue with this great material. And speaking of Krakoa, that is where the particular run starts. And we find out very early on that this is a mutant utopia. It's actually not just a place, but it's actually a living, breathing island in and of itself. Kind of like a habitat organism that is conscious, has consciousness.
Right. And before I started reading it, like, I had heard people talking about Krakoa, this island, in this storyline, but I did not realize that it was going to end up being a mutant itself. I thought that was really cool. And the fact that it spoke a language that none of them had ever heard of or seen. And so they had to get a mutant that's able to decipher different languages, hence his name being Cypher, to be able to communicate with it. It was just really, it's just mind-boggling how intricate and everything it is. It takes place over thousands of years, back and forth, but it never feels confusing, to me at least. It didn't.
No, I don't think in the slightest, and I think that's because later on in this particular collected run, or I'm sure in one of the issues that you read if you do the single issue route, you get an explanation that there is X-Men Year 1, X-Men Year 10, X-Men Year 100, X-Men Year 1000, and so it goes back and forth, yes, between those time periods, but it tells you in the panels if this is X-Men Year 1 event, or if this is X-Men Year 10, so on and so forth. So there again, for those of you that are watching The Witcher, listen to our Witcher episode. Subtitles go a long way, folks, when it comes to chronological order.
Yes, and I just thought it was cool. The way I kept track of it was that House of X is pretty much like a house or a collection of mutants. So House of X, me being the name, and then Powers of 10. Each year that you go to is either 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years. So it's in magnitude of tens. So it's just a way to keep track of it while you're reading back and forth from each different issue. But yeah, I love the way it's set up, the way it reads and everything.
And to go back to Cypher for just a second, I'm really glad that we got him in this run, because that's one of those mutants that, unless you are a true to your core nerd, don't really know all that much about without doing research.
Right.
But it's just a fun mutation to have, that being omnilingual. It's just really impressive, and it's just cool to see that actually unravel as you flip the pages. And they, of course, were able to come up with their own Krakoan alphabet, and it's one that the language itself, like you said, is one that only Cypher knows. Yes, but each mutant that's born on Krakoa has at least a vague understanding of the symbols and what goes behind it, so it sort of kind of becomes their language as well.
Well, from what I gathered, Charles, like when they first come, either Charles does it or another telepath, I can't remember who, but actually like embeds the language into them, and so that they're able to communicate. But another thing about Cypher that I really liked was, and this is really true throughout the whole series, the comedy that they sprinkled into this run. It never felt forced. It never felt like there was too much. It was perfect, in my opinion. And like one of my favorite parts was where Cypher first meets the island and he's trying to figure out the language, and you think he's kind of struggling with it at first, but then like the island says something and it's like this huge long thing, and Cypher, like, he listens, and then Charles asks him what did it say, and then Cypher's like, well, he said this, and he gives like this whole big speech more or less, or backstory for this island. And then at the very end of it, he says, or something like that, something similar to that.
Oh yeah, and that made me laugh out loud because, like you said, it is this multi-panel scenario of him talking about more or less a snippet history, a Spark Notes type deal of Krakoa being told by the island,
Right.
and we get a really nice nugget in that multi-panel scene because we see that Apocalypse actually was one of the first ones to have interaction with Krakoa, actually fought on its behalf years and years and eons ago. And so now for Xavier to come back full circle, it's just a really neat process. And yeah, like you said, the comedy, I think, throughout this particular run is well timed. And yeah, it never feels forced or corny or cheesy.
Right.
And so that to me was really great to see.
And that actually brings me to another point in the story, which is the villains, because it's hilarious and weird, but they all basically become good guys and are with the X-Men, fighting with the X-Men, whether it's Magneto or Apocalypse, like you said, or a Mr. Sinister. They all basically they put their differences with each other aside and become one. And you think, well, eventually one of these bad guys is going to turn on them or betray them, and it doesn't ever happen.
No, it doesn't. And, to me, I think the most impressive part was the fact that all three of them, let alone any one of them, was able to pacify their hunger for power and dominance.
Right.
For the overall better cause of mutantdom. That was impressive because I'm with you. I thought for sure, I'm like, especially Magneto.
Right.
Because he's got that history of, I'll work with you, Charles, I'll work with you, until one of them betrays the other or he doesn't agree with a point that Charles makes. And then he's like, hey, let's, go ahead and split ways here. Nope, I'm going to go back to I don't want to say the dark side, but
right.
I'm going to go back to my view and you have your view and we're just going to be two different schools of thoughts and now I'm going to do whatever I want because I'm Magneto and I can.
Right. And it honestly, it makes sense that doesn't happen because the one thing that they really always fought over was mutants versus humans, and Charles was always on the side of the humans. He was also on the side of the mutants as well, but he would fight for the humans, and that's kind of gone.
Oh, it's completely days of old school thinking, and we find that out essentially by his relationship with Myra McTaggart and her character. This is a really good segue to get into. So their relationship, as most people know, is one that's quite interesting. So of course, it's for the most part a love interest, but there's also a lot of interest in regards to that mutant-human relationship, building those bridges and combining forces and trying to come up with a betterment for both sides. And in this run in particular, we get a little bit of a game changer, and that is that Myra McTaggart actually turns out to be a mutant herself, and her particular mutation is reincarnation.
Right, and that becomes a big part of the whole story, just because she's the one with all the information and knowledge about what's happening or what's going to happen, and it's just crazy. I like that they changed that character and did something new with her. She's always been, or at least as far as I'm aware, she's always been just a regular human, and this is a complete clean slate change to that character. So I really enjoyed that.
Oh, I did too, and I think their back and forth between Charles and Myra throughout the run was neat. And for me, which it could be that some folks reading this will get a little perturbed with the fact that they recur some panels between Myra and Charles. And what I mean by that, if you've read this with us, as we have, you'll notice that throughout some issues or chapters, in my case, there are these recurring panels where Myra's at a fair and she's saying, I should be enjoying this moment, but there just seems to be other things bothering me, or it's like these people just need to have a show put on. And she's talking to Charles and he says, well, this actually would be something that wouldn't interest me, but the clouds are parting just the right way and it seems like I'm where I need to be and I've got this dream, would you like to hear it?
Right.
And of course at that moment she drops the knowledge of, well, it's not a dream if it's already real. And he's like, excuse me? And she of course says, why don't you read my mind and figure out who I am.
We know
here.
each other pretty well, and you should read my mind to see what I mean.
And then, of course, when he does that, later on, he's able to see exactly, like you said, her lives that she's lived, what she's gone through, what she's experienced, and he she finds out very quickly, oh wow, my dream actually winds up being more or less a lie, or it doesn't pan out the way that I think it will, and that in just about every feasible outcome we lose.
Right. Yeah, that's basically one of the big turning points for Charles, is he realizes that humans and mutants, or so it seems, will never be able to live peacefully together, and just everything he's always believed in and fought for seems to be fading away in this storyline. And that being the main struggle between him and Magneto, it kind of pushes them closer together, more or less.
I think for me, really Margaret Mataggart, I should say, doing all of this research, and unfortunately having to go through these multiple versions of reincarnation and lose her life on a number of different occasions, but for good reason. It's for the betterment of mutantdom. Mm-hmm. She is able to convince both of them to work together. She's really the one kind of pulling the strings all along behind the scenes, and I loved that in this particular run, because when I first saw her, the whole reincarnation thing was cool, but I didn't expect it to go to that length for her to really be the main protagonist throughout this entire run. It was a nice surprise, and it was just neat to see. And the coolest moment to me, I think, for her character in particular, is towards the very end. We get another one of those recurring panels where they're at the fair, festival, carnival, whatever you want to call it, and she explains to him, that's the recur, is that she keeps asking, hey, read my mind and find out what I know and who I am. And
pretty much every time there's something new in there, because she's already lived that life, and each time something different happens and more of the story develops.
Absolutely. And so it comes to a head at the very end, and so it's almost borderline painful for him to go through and read her mind and see all of these events.
Right.
And so he says, the same thing that he said in earlier panels, I can't believe all this has happened, we always lose. And so she finally comes to tell him, you're right, and throughout all of this, I've made a multitude of decisions, and I've been in and out of love with you, haven't met you, and I've felt every possible feasible spectrum of emotion that a human can feel for another human or mutant in this case.
Right.
And you, Charles, have never once changed. And at first, Charles in one panel says, oh, well, thanks, thinking it's a compliment.
Right.
The panel right below that, she looks at him deadpan and says, it's not a compliment. You have a certain way of thinking, and you think that you're going to be able to cohabitate with humanity, and everything's going to be rainbow and sunshines and work out. Newsflash, I'm going to have to break that part of you in order for mutantdom to survive and even remotely have a chance.
Yeah, Moira was one of the more complex and interesting characters of this run, and I'd almost be willing to say that she was one of my favorites, if not my favorite character throughout it, just because of the things that she was willing to do and go through to try and save things and make things turn out differently was just really cool. I mean, there's one part of the story where she goes with Logan or Wolverine, whichever one you want to refer to him as. They go to get information on Nimrod, this bad, the main villain of the story, or one of them. And while they're there, they get the information, and then Wolverine gets it back to Moira, and he does something where he injects it into her, all the information, to where she has it in her mind, and then you don't realize what's going to happen. I thought they were just going to end up going back with the information, but what happens is Wolverine basically said, are you ready, or are you sure that we need to do this, or something to that effect, and Moira's like, yeah, go ahead. And there was something that Wolverine said that she says to Wolverine that you were a big fan of. What was it?
Oh, for sure. And so when he is about ready to do the deed, he says, like you mentioned, are you sure this is absolutely necessary?
Right.
And
well, I guess we should mention that what he does is he ends up shoving his claw through her chest and basically kills her.
Yep.
And so she can come back and live another life
with that
knowledge to hopefully fix things again.
Right. And so the line that Marva drops is, well, it's what you do.
Right.
And I personally loved that because growing up a big Wolverine fan, of course, one of his most iconic lines is, I'm the best there is at what I do, but what I do isn't very nice.
Right.
And so I thought of that when she said that, and the minute she said that, I was like, I see what they did there.
Yeah.
And there's a couple callbacks and nostalgia moments throughout this run, so it's just another reason why we enjoyed it so much. But yeah, I think that's fair to say that she's one of your favorite characters. For me, I think it was just kind of an oddball character that I'd forgotten forgotten about until I saw him again in the panels, and that was Zorn. So this is a mutant that has a miniature star inside of his head, and so that gives him all kinds of cosmic mutated abilities.
Yeah, like a black hole or something.
Sort of either a black hole or a sun, some type of mini star. And of course, if you remove his mask at any point, it's very unstable, so it's not the best move to do.
Right.
But later in this particular run, it's a move that they more or less have to do because they've hit a wall, and it's either that or die a horrible death by these, almost like post-humanity sentinels that are now going after mutants, or any that are left. It's pretty much all robotics at one point in the year 1000, I think it is.
I think so too. But yeah, that character was interesting to me. Just, I don't know much about him, but I thought it was interesting because every time they were in a bad situation, at least while he was there, it seemed like he wanted to die. Like he was disappointed when they didn't have to kill him or remove his mask at one point. And I thought that was odd. Like, why does this guy want to die so bad? But I mean, he basically was like, I want to go out with a bang. Well, literally. But it was just interesting to me that character was so obsessed with dying. I don't know what that particularly had to do with
perhaps
anything.
Perhaps it was a personal vendetta. I'm not sure, but he definitely was an interesting character for sure. Other than him, maybe Rasputin, just because it was really cool to see how that character looked. The huge sword that was wielded, awesome, and it just was neat to see some, maybe not necessarily new characters, but at least for me, characters that I'm seeing for the first time or that I'd forgotten about that get reintroduced in this particular run. So just a lot to like about House of X, Powers of X, or Powers of 10.
Right, yeah, I agree. And I guess, I liked all the characters, but what stood out to me about Moira was just how intricate and, complex her character was, basically. And she was the biggest change in this book versus the rest of the X-Men. Just all the others were still the same old characters and acted more or less like they always have.
Pretty much how you would expect them to. And, she even, like I said earlier, was pulling the strings the whole time on just about every side mission that, whether it was Charles or Magneto, went on, what have you. And one of which led them to Mr. Sinister. And we get some more of that comedic relief. And you had brought this up before we started this episode, Cap, that it was kind of a boss move by Charles Xavier to not only go into Mr. Sinister's domain, but then tell him, hey, this is why we're here. Here's what you're going to do for us, which is make carbon copies of DNA for all mutants, house them, and keep them. Oh, and by the way, you're not going to tamper with them because you're going to forget that we were ever here. We asked you to do this for us.
Yeah,
but when I call upon you, you'll remember.
Yeah, and that was actually one of my favorite parts of the whole story was when they go to see Mr. Sinister, just because, again, there was a lot of comedy, but it was kind of right along with, it was comedic, but then this guy is not a good guy and he's serious, because basically they go and there's a whole bunch of different versions of him that are all standing around waiting and waiting on him. And I guess Magneto is with Charles, and Mr. Sinister says, that's a really nice cape. And then he was like, how come I don't have a cape? I should have a cape. I can't believe I've never thought of this. Why don't I have a cape? And one of the other versions of himself looks more or less like a butler type character, and he asked the butler, he's like, why don't I have a cape? And the butler's like, well, I don't know, but I've always thought you would look good in a cape. And then he flips a 180, and this is where that this guy is not a good guy, because he basically just says, why haven't you told me? If you feel like I should have had a cape, why haven't you mentioned it before? And the guy's just standing there scared to say anything else, and then he just shouts and orders for one of his other versions, kill this man, and they do. And so then you're just sitting there like, oh, okay, that just happened. This guy is not stable.
And then a follow-up funny moment to that is that particular version of Mr. Sinister tries to refute Charles's request and says, there is a version of me that has a mutant gene, but me personally, I'm not going to sign up for this. This doesn't sit right with me. And then we see in Manette's panel his head being blasted off, and the mutant gene version of Sinister, who has a cape, says, I'm fine with all of this. Let's talk business.
Right. And he even says, well, I had a version of me with a mutant gene, but it didn't work work out very well, or that guy wasn't a really good guy or something like that. And it was just funny because you think that he did away with him or something, but then right there he comes. And it was just funny how it all played out. And I will say, I think it was all different versions of him. Didn't it look like it to you?
Because, to the best of my knowledge, Mr. Sinister is somebody that's obsessed with genetics.
Yeah.
And so he's always not only practicing on copies of himself, but trying to push the boundaries when it comes to that realm of expertise.
Okay. Yeah, I thought, like I said, looking at them, they all looked like him. So I assumed that all of them were just different versions of him. But I just wanted to be sure of that.
Oh, yeah, you're on point there. And I think to go and piggyback off of that, as far as, that being a key moment in the storyline where they had to get all of the different mutant genes housed and stocked, there was a big reason for that. And that's, of course, so with Moira McTaggart being this voice of reason for both Charles and all of the others there on Krakoa, as far as, hey, this is what I know, this is what's happened, here's how we can try and correct this and right the ship. One of their game plans was to, of course, get all of the mutants' DNA somewhere housed safe, so they've got it, not to clone them, but to bring them back. So, of course, you got the shell of, say, a Cyclops or a Nightcrawler, what have you, but that's not quite the whole puzzle. You still need their essence or their personality, their feelings, their thoughts, etc., memories.
Soul, more or less.
Yeah, soul, more or less. And so, for the longest time, when you hear Cerebro, you think, oh yeah, the device that Charles uses to find and locate all the mutants. And that still holds true in this run.
Right.
But we find out that that's sort of a secondary reason for why he uses Cerebro. And the primary reason is he's actually making copies of all of the mutants that he comes into contact with. And not only makes copies of them, but is able to extract their essence, their thoughts, their memories, their feelings, their personalities, to the point that when he brings them back, they are Cyclops, they are Nightcrawler, they are Jean Grey, so on and so forth.
Right, and you said, what'd you say? It says in there that it takes him like 3 days
and so
to do this?
The side notes that you get throughout these runs are fantastic as well, because at any point during this reading that I had a question, within the next couple pages, it gives you a breakdown with notes or examples that basically explains, for the most part, whatever your question is. And so yes, it's a process where he'll do weekly backups just to kind of as a safeguard, just in case, because of course throughout this process you think, well, people change from year to year. So it's like, if he finds them once, does he then not ever go back and do another backup?
Right.
And so what he does is he picks a time of each year, and it's a 3-day process where he will go in and do a hard backup of every mutant in existence. Right, talk about a lengthy process. I wouldn't want that job. And so he literally backs up everybody's data just so that when they come back, whether they've had a epiphany or life-changing moment, or they've gone down a different path, they're going to be whoever they are, presumably, heaven forbid, if they do pass away. And it's important to note that the process is very selective. So, for example, if you go missing, he won't necessarily bring that mutant back by the rebirthing process and the backup data. The particular mutant has to actually be confirmed as deceased.
Right, that makes sense.
So, just to not have a doppelganger situation or anything like that. So, but still, when I read that, I was like, oh, but this could be, a situation where somebody could pretend, to be deceased, and then that could open up new avenues.
Right.
So, at the end of this particular run, there's a lot that, is unanswered, and I love it because it's going to spring, I'm sure, all kinds of spin-offs and different versions. But to me, I just thought that particular facet of the run, the fact that he could use Cerebro to, carbon copy people's memories and personalities and bring them all back is incredible.
Oh, definitely. And actually, going back to what you were saying about the possibility of spin-offs, there actually has been several spin-offs since the ending of House of X, Powers of X.
Nice.
There is the main X-Men run now, which is being written by Jonathan Hickman, and then there's 5 different spin-offs, which are basically just different stories following different groups of X-Men on their own, like, side missions, basically. So I would encourage everybody to look those up and see if you're interested.
And so as we wind down our discussion here of hotspots, let me ask you, Cap, what was one of your favorite moments of this run? I've got mine ready, but I want to go ahead and see what yours is first.
Honestly, probably the small mission / storyline where the team gets sent by Xavier to destroy the Mother Mold, which is this huge contraption that creates the Sentinels and enables the bad guys, or the villains, which are artificial intelligence and machines to advance and overtake the good guys. It was just very exciting, and it was kind of on the edge of your seat type of situation. So that part I had the most fun with. It was very intense.
And I have to agree in the sense that it's a really big moment in a way, because we lose pretty much the core X-Men group: Cyclops, Jean Grey, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, etc.
Yeah, that's true.
And especially Nightcrawler and Wolverine, because they're, of course, Nightcrawler is bamfing to each lock station that has this Mother Mold's head, essentially, is what it starts out with, and that eventually develops consciousness and stability and creates, like you said, multiple Sentinels. And I believe this particular station ends up creating Nimrod, the Sentinel that for decades and decades, maybe even hundreds of years, takes out mutants in all different walks of life.
Speaking of the Mother Mold and the different Sentinels and how advanced they are and what kinds there are, I really liked that Jonathan Hickman, when explaining it, he utilized a real-life concept that is called the Kardashev scale, which is a measurement of the advancement in technology for different civilizations. And there's 3 different scales, or 3 different levels to the scale. And it's just a really interesting concept in that each level describes what that civilization was able to do technologically. And level 1 is the civilization was able to harness all of the resources on their home planet. And then level 2 is where the civilization was able to harness all of the resources of their home star, where they basically build a machine that can basically a higher version of solar panels or solar technology. And then level 3 is a civilization that is able to harness all of the resources of their home galaxy, and they become mobile and able to leave their home and leave their galaxy to consume resources from another galaxy somewhere. And just to put it in perspective, it's said that humanity right now is at 0.7 below a level 1, and it's said that we should reach level 1 in the next couple hundred years, and then it goes up to a very extreme amount of time between the next level and the 3rd level. So it's just really cool that he compared the different levels of the Sentinels and the artificial intelligence in that way.
For sure, and he breaks it down in sort of an infographic list of like the different levels, as you mentioned,
right,
of those Sentinel societies and their level of intelligence, and that's based on their level of intelligence is sort of the ranking of how high up or well off that particular Sentinel civilization is.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the infographics and all the notes are easily one of my favorite parts of this run, just because it's interactive and you get the best of both worlds with comic and science, I think,
mm-hmm.
honestly. And of course, obviously most of this is science fiction, but still,
right,
it's just enjoyable for whoever picks it up. And to me, one of my favorite parts was the description or explanation of what an Omega level mutant is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of people have an idea of what and who Omega level mutants are, but we actually get a known list in this particular run by Jonathan Hickman and company. And just to name off of a few, we got Robert Drake, who is Iceman. We also got Jean Grey. I think everybody pretty well knew that. Eric Lenscher is Magneto, another one that's pretty popular. We've got Aurora Monroe as Storm, and then we've got some ones that surprised us, and that was Franklin Richards, so aka Powerhouse, which is the son of Sue Storm and Reed Richards. So the Fantastic Four, part of the Fantastic Four, their
right,
child,
yeah,
is Franklin Richards. And so to know that he is a Omega level, of course he's listed as a human here in Hickman's run, but still, the fact that he's at Omega level, which is understandable because, I mean, those two together are pretty impressive, so we can imagine that their offspring would also be equally powerful or impressive.
And I honestly didn't know that until reading this storyline about their kid, and that he was that major of a character.
Right, and then just some other lesser known. We've got Proteus, who is the son of Myra Mid-Taggart and Kevin Mid-Taggart, and then of course we've also, speaking of sons, we've got Legion, David Haller, son of Professor X, and so on and so forth. Kid Omega is another one, Quentin Quire, that comes up to mind. He's a pretty powerful guy. If you need to do some research, feel free. We did as well.
Right.
And just the sheer amount of telepathy powers that he has and matter manipulation, things of that nature, it's pretty impressive. All of these particular mutants that are listed here in this book are just off charts, and that's exactly what it says when it describes an Omega level mutant as a mutant whose dominant power is deemed to register or reach an undefinable or upper limit of that power-specific classification.
Right.
So, like I said, just the little tidbits and notes that we did throughout this run were just a lot of fun for me to read, and just every question that I had while I was reading this, redo of the X-Men, or as you coined earlier, Cap, the Hickmen.
Yeah, it's funny because every run that he's written, there's been some kind of, like, I guess, nickname for the different ones, and like the Avengers, people generally refer to it as the Hickvengers, and so the X-Men, I just figured, well, Hickman works for them to be called the X-Men. It's just funny.
Yeah, no, I like it, and so that really brings us to, of course, hit the highlights.
Right,
this
but
particular
before
run.
you move off of this subject real quick,
Sure.
what did you say that was surprising to you about Professor X and the Omega level?
Yes, so of
Mutants.
course, in this particular run and on this list, a name that you won't see is Charles Xavier. And so at first I thought, well, wait a minute, he's got to be
Right.
Omega because he's the strongest telepath known in the X-Men lore. And then I had to do some more research and realized that there's a slight difference. Yes, there are some mutants that have Omega level powers, and that's one thing. But it's another thing entirely to be an Omega level mutant. For example, and there's actually, I'm pulling this right out of the book, so it's not like I knew this before.
Right.
So take Magneto. He is a Omega level mutant because his power of magnetism is to a degree that he could literally change the rotation of the Earth's axis.
Right.
So that's a game changer, right? Or even a cosmic changer in some of these particular characters' powers. For Charles, he basically chooses not to be an Omega level mutant because of his consciousness and the fact that he technically could take over all of the minds on Earth, and who knows how far reaching he could even go out into the galaxy, but he chooses not to. So is he an Omega level mutant? At the end of the day, it seems like yes, but it's just that fact that right now the only thing that is Omega for him is his telepathy. So that, I guess, keeps him from being an alpha.
So he basically keeps himself in check.
Exactly.
Versus the others.
As an alpha mutant, whereas the rest of these guys are either unchecked or they know they've got that power and they choose to act upon it. But an example of somebody that has no Omega level power but isn't an Omega level mutant would be Forge, who's also mentioned briefly in this run. He's known for technopathy, which I believe would be building things with the power of his mind. It's conceivable that there could be somebody out there that could outdo him or outbuild him with higher levels of technopathy, but to the best of our knowledge, for him, it's an Omega level power, but he's not an Omega level mutant, if that makes sense.
Right. So basically, whatever your mutant power is, if you're so powerful that there's nobody else that can meet you on the same level of your power, that makes you an Omega level mutant.
At least from the way that I'm understanding this list. Now, it could be different, and this is definitely something that I'm sure can start arguments in a number of comment threads by those more in the know of exactly what Omega level really truly means. But for me, somebody that's just surface level X-Men fan, I enjoyed getting a bit of a history lesson on exactly what that entailed.
Definitely.
And so, like I said, we'll go ahead and wrap up this discussion of our run and read on Hotspots. And so in the very end, we get a great moment where Moira McTaggart comes back out of her stasis where she was, kind of locked away for safety's sake. And they've gotten to a point to where Krakoa is in full swing. They are a nation. They're being recognized by the rest of the world. It's definitely going to be this mutant safe haven. They've got it the way that they want it. Of course, they have a conversation. They build a council amongst themselves of various different characters that you get throughout the run. And Moira asks, how is all of this going? Of course, Xavier and Eric let her know that everything's going along just swimmingly. What's our next steps? What's our next phases? And part of that is wondering, should we bring back, certain mutants that have passed on before? And she says, well, maybe some, but not others. One in particular being Destiny, who can see the future, or any mutant that can see the future. Big reason being is because Destiny has a run-in, quite literally, with, both figuratively and literally, with Moira McTaggart earlier in the run.
Right.
And she says, you can try and change the future all you want, but no matter what, I'm going to find you and stop you from doing so because you can't mess with Destiny, or more or less you can't mess with me.
Right.
So McTaggart very much wants her to stay gone.
Definitely.
So that they at least have a chance to not lose, because she ultimately still tells Charles, the truth, and that's that we're always going to lose, but this particular scenario is our best case for now. And so we get a great line at the very end where Eric says, she's right, the truth is we're probably still going to lose, but at least this time we're going to give them a fight, and I'd like to see them try. And at the very, very end, Charles says, yes, let them try.
And it's really, it's an ending to this story, yes, but it's very much left open and to continue, which it does in all of the spin-offs and the main story, or main X-Men story that's going on now.
Absolutely. There's all kinds of possibilities as to what can happen from where this particular run leaves off, and personally I know we're excited to see exactly where that ends up.
Right.
And so with that, Cap, let's give this a true nerdy by nature ranking here. So I'll start. For me, it was hard not to give this one a 5 out of 5, because we've talked about this before. So of course our scale is 1 to 5 nerds, as you all know. And to me, 5 really has to be deserving, has to be game-changing, mythos-altering, etc. Which this is close. It's really close, and it's really well done. But for me, I think overall, I'm going to still have to give it a 4.5. So close, almost 5, almost 5 nerds.
Yeah.
But just not quite. But I mean, I can't think of anything negative to say about this or anything that I didn't like, other than maybe getting a little bit more of the Beast.
Right.
He seemed a little absent in this run, but otherwise, it's just fantastic from cover to cover. Really enjoyed it and would recommend it to anybody that's an X-Men fan or a Hickman fan for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that being said, I'm a very big Hickman fan and really enjoyed most of his runs on different characters. So I am going to give it a 5, but that's just me. I mean,
okay, so your first 5 out of 5.
Right. We're both allowed to have our own opinion, so it doesn't have to match up every time. But I just enjoyed it from beginning to end, and just it still boggles my mind how well written and how well he was able to address pretty much every mutant that you could think of and tie it all together, and just being able to move from future to past to now to everything. It was just very, very well done in my opinion. So
no doubt. And so that will officially wrap up this episode for Nerdy by Nature. As always, we thank you, the listener, for listening. And just a reminder, feel free to hit the like button, share this with everybody that you think would be interested in this particular podcast in this realm. As always, be sure to leave us comments, let us know what we got right, what we got wrong, what you would like to hear in the future. And of course, feel free to have open discussions on our Facebook group as well. So our next episode is going to be on the hot movie that just dropped, and that is Bad Boys for Life. That's right, Will Smith and Martin Lawrence are back, and we're excited about it because the first 2 movies were just a romping good time, comedy, action, pretty much everything you would want with a buddy cop style movie, Cap. So we look forward to, of course, watching the film and then giving you a true Nerdy by Nature review and ranking.
Absolutely. And I will say, honestly, I'm an unabashed fan of Michael Bay. I understand the criticisms. Yes, his movies and characters aren't necessarily the most complex, but his movies are always still a lot of fun, and I've always enjoyed them, and I'm a big fan of Bad Boys, so I'm very excited about it.
And as am I. It's going to be a good review, and hopefully this particular final chapter in the series of films is going to go out with a bang and in a big way, which, considering the fact that it's a Michael Bay film, probably almost a guarantee. So we will be interested to see what that looks like, and of course obviously interested to bring that to you and give you that full Nerdy by Nature treatment. Until then, I'm Agent Smith signing off.
And I'm Captain Rogers. God bless.